Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Nick Pyenson. I come to you from just a mile or two downtown at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I'm a paleontologist by training, but my expertise focuses on marine mammals. And my neighbor down the street, David Ermish, helped coordinate my visit here today. So I'm very happy to be here and appreciative that Katie also helped coordinate the lecture, because I just think in general, federal science agencies should have more exchange, and this is a great way to have cross-pollination and boost morale for the issues that matter to us and for the work that we do. I was just thinking right now, NOAA actually, while it was created in the 1970s, actually has a longer history through the National Marine Fisheries Service that started with Spencer Fullerton Baird, who is not just the second secretary of the Smithsonian, but was actually the first director of the National Museum of Natural History. So there's a deep genealogical tie between our two institutions, and this, I hope, is a good measure of that continuing legacy and interaction. What I wanted to talk about today was just tell you a bit about my research and a lot of the ways that I think about the work that I do. And I think that that is insightful for people who work here, some of whom may do research, others who, let's get a show of hands. How many are research scientists or in that kind of cadre here? Even loosely, if you'd call yourself a scientist. Okay. See some reluctant hands back there. A lot of the work we do at Natural History is very focused on the research side. And that's one of the big challenges, I think. We're a public-facing institution, very much like you guys are, but we have 7 million people who come through our doors, whether we want them to or not. And that's generally a great thing. How we deal with that is both a challenge and a gift. And what people don't see is that 99.9% of our possessions, the things that we are charged with taking care of, are not on display and not visible to the galleries. So there's a big part of our mission in terms of devoted resources that don't go to anything that's really that visible, aside from occasionally if we're able to get our research out. So that's one of the motivations that I had for writing a book, to talk about a lot of the work I do, because I thought that's important. And I think that's a measure of our responsibility too as federal employees, to make sure that taxpayers actually and the general public know what we do. So we try to diminish these issues about a lack of understanding, and perception is important, I think. So one of the major aspects of what at least my expertise, is on whales, cetaceans, marine mammals that have been in the water for the last 50 million years. And also we care about them too, because they're, by federal mandate, there are resources that need to be protected. And I think a lot of people in the room know about that. And I'll get to NOAA related items throughout my talk. Actually, a lot of my colleagues and I apply for permits through National Marine Fisheries Service to do the work we do. So there's not just a genealogical connection between our institutions, but actual functional daily needs as well. I don't really need to go to belabor this point, but we think of cetaceans and whales in this kind of charismatic and iconic view of whales just underneath the surface of the water. And that's a useful frame, I think, for trying to understand the challenges of studying them, because while this is kind of like catnip to the public, people really love whales for a variety of reasons. One of the aspects about studying them, about the logistics of getting either close enough with NOAA permits to study them, is that we don't actually get to track them throughout their entire lives. Most of their lives is inaccessible to us. So if we want to know about them from a scientific point of view, we need to be clever about the kinds of tools and the kinds of logistics that we do to study them. And that includes not just their lives today, but also if we want to look at their evolutionary history, and I think where they're going. As scientists, we can make predictions about how the ways that we are changing the world can impact lineages that we think are important to function. I like putting up this slide because it reminds you that our interactions with cetaceans are very deep and culturally tied. These are the golden discs from the Voyager space probes, which are now both outside of our solar system. They were launched in the late 70s on this grand tour of the solar system on the Voyager spacecraft, to go look at the rocky and gas planets on their way through the solar system, and they are also carrying messages too. So on these golden discs, they're records, and you can go on YouTube and hear their sounds. Or if you have one of their records and have a record player, you can play it. There's kind of 3 categories of information on these discs. It's really interesting. It's very groovy. It's very, very to the time of the 1970s. So there's greetings. There's human greetings in 52 languages. There's sounds of the world, and then there are images too that are encoded. Whale song are on these discs. Humpback whale song is on these discs. So those are males singing. Only the males sing, and we've followed humpback whale song ever since we've discovered that they actually sing. And that song has evolved through time. It's been elaborated. It's very complex. There's a lot of dense information that's being exchanged. What they're saying, we don't know. And that's the key point, because the people who made these discs decided to put whale song on the greeting side and not on the sounds of the natural world. So the whale song is interlaced with human greetings. You should really listen to it. It's kind of fun. But that just underscores how much we presume we think we know about whales, dated into the 1970s, early 1970s. That really hasn't changed. We still don't really know what whale song is about. Even if we can describe it and apply more sophisticated tools to understanding it, we still don't know. And that aspect of mystery, I think, is great, because if you're a young scientist, that says there's a lot still to discover. And that's an aspect I try to communicate to students in my lab, to remember that while we're doing all the work and looking at the data, there's still so much we don't know. So that image I had at the start of the talk of the humpback whale underwater, that was in Wilhelmina Bay in Antarctica. And this is what it looks like at the surface. This is just a few years ago, working with colleagues to put tags like this on the backs of whales. And I'll pass this around. This actually should have 4 suction cups on it, but it doesn't right now. And that's a tag from that's probably like a 4th generation tag. We're now, and it's like iPhone, so we're into the 11th generation. And there's a housing in there for to collect video along with audio. And the basic device is exactly like our cell phones. It has an accelerometer. It can record changes in pitch, yaw, and roll. And if you're these days, it has both cameras facing forward and aft, which is great, because the idea is you get close enough to a whale, you're able to stick a tag, removable tag, on their back. And that's a way to understand, to reach back or pull back on the inaccessibility by knowing something about what they do underwater when we're not around to see them. If you look at that tag, there's a little spinny thing. You're probably wondering what that is. That was an early attempt to get at changes in speed. So that's a flow meter. And that's actually pointing towards, ideally, to the front of the animal, if you deploy the tag correctly. But this image, it's a GoPro still, so we're always trying to record everything we can when we're out in the field, really to me underscores just how hard it is to know and approach anything about animals that weigh, in some cases, 40 tons or more, can turn like a dime underwater and only come to the surface less than 1% of their life, right? A lot of the ability to know about them is tied to their fundamental natural history, which is inaccessible and remote. So how do we know anything about whales? If you come to the Natural History Museum downtown, one way that you can know about them is by the traces they leave of their lives, most palpably through their skeletons. And the Smithsonian has the largest collection of marine mammal bones and whale bones as a subset in the world. We have some 30,000 specimens that have been collected over the last 200 years. It includes diversity that is unrivaled by any other institution around the world. There are other institutions that fortunately keep whale bones in their collections, but none as rich and as diverse as the Smithsonian's. And it includes not just the skeletons of living whales, but also, this is my expertise as a paleontologist, fossil whales. So on display is a 40 million year old fossil whale that is native to this part of the United States. And it's actually one of the first fossils found in the United States in the 1840s. It's an early whale called Basilosaurus. Why it sounds like a dinosaur, we can talk more about that if we have time at the Q&A. But just take my word for it. It's called Basilosaurus, that's its scientific name, but it is an early whale. And if you, let's see if I can get the laser to work. I can just walk over and point. So some of the things that look whale-like are obviously the long vertebral column. It has a long tail. It has vestigial hind limbs. So those are really, really tiny, not weight-bearing, but they do reflect that ancestry of terrestriality. Whales had ancestors that lived on land some 50 million years ago. And within the first 10 million years, they've already become completely adapted to living in water. So much so that they don't have weight-bearing hind limbs and not weight-bearing forelimbs. Those forelimbs that were once adapted for moving on land with their land ancestors, already at about 40 million years, are flipper-like. And actually whales at this time still had elbows. Today, if you look at any whale skeleton, they don't have elbows. They're just kind of fixed forelimbs. If you look at the front end of Basilosaurus, it has those really sharp sea monster-like teeth. And if you look carefully, it's got 4 different kinds of teeth, just like you and I. Incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. Whales today don't have those kinds of teeth. They have teeth, they have peg-like teeth. Otherwise, the other group, the 2 great branches, toothed whales, baleen whales don't have teeth. They have them in utero, and that's a very interesting aspect to their evolution. We can talk more about that. But this is really a whale in transition. And so the fossil record of whales is great because it tells us something that we wouldn't otherwise know. If you didn't have the fossil record, you would look at whales and say, gee, how did this ever happen? Mammals that are completely adapted to life in the water, what's going on? Because all of their nearest ancestors don't look like whales. And so this is all just paleo art, and this is, something that paleontologists get artists to do is they find fragmentary remains and they get somebody to illustrate what they look like. I wanted 3 vignettes to kind of show terrestriality, being semi-aquatic and then fully aquatic, but these aren't evenly split up over the chronology of their history, some 50 million years. The first 10 million years are these 2 stages of going from 4-legged to semi-aquatic, and then after about 40 million years, they're completely aquatic. And that's great because they've left even a better fossil record after that 40 million years. We do have fossils of these earliest whales kind of stuck in transition from land to sea, but they tend to be in geopolitically sensitive places. Parts of Africa and certainly parts of South Asia that you can't get to, like Afghanistan and Pakistan, that are just really tricky to do field work in. But we do have, the fossils we do have are just really amazing because they do show you these transitions that we see in the skeletal system that we infer a lot actually about their ecology. So the earliest whales living on land, and then these transitions, these transformations that happen to allow them to become these amazing marine mammals living in ocean ecosystems. We have this kind of narrative of early whale evolution that if you look in biology textbooks, goes in a straight line. But one of the great contributions of Darwin, of course, is telling us that life is not an easily organized ladder. When we look backwards, it sure looks like it was predetermined, but we do know that life is more like a tree. It has bushy branches, many of which are extinct. So the real way I like to think about whale evolution, at least for the first part of their history, is more like this. You kind of have, at the time in the Eocene, some 40 million years, something that looked like this kind of beach party, where you have different whales of different stripes that were doing ecological modes, some of which we can identify and others of which have no analog today. Some look like crocs, some look like sea lions, some look like sea otters, but then there's some that completely are without analog. And the really important point here is that all these early experiments are different lineages of early whales that went extinct. The only ones that begat anything were the whales that managed to make do in the water and living obligately fully in the water without having weight-bearing limbs like these guys. So that's supposed to be one of the ancestors to Basilosaurus. And that's all paleo art. I've shown you kind of nice illustrations. What do we actually know about that physical record? Well, one of the big points about the fossil record is that it's mostly incomplete. These are the hands of Carlos Perito, who was formerly a grad student and now a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan. In his hands are some 40 million years of tooth evolution in whales. These are the teeth from different species of extinct whales. And if you remember that slide of Basilosaurus at the beginning, it had different kinds of teeth. Well, its molar teeth were very complex and looked a lot like this. Very jagged, very denticulate with lots of cusps. Those are teeth meant for cutting up flesh, either fish or other marine mammals that were alive at the time. Today, whale teeth are much simplified. So there's a story about change and complexity through time. But for the most part, what we know about any one time period for any one place of whale evolution you can kind of put on one or two tables. The fossil record is mostly incomplete, but not always. Sometimes you get these little windows into the past that tend to be a lot more complete, where you find a lot more material. And one of those places happened to be a field site very close to where I was doing work. This is now about 8 years ago. We've continued working in South America and Chile. This is in the Atacama Desert, so the Atacama region of Chile, northern Chile. And the strip of road here on the right side of the image is the Pan American Highway. That's Route 1 here in the United States, and you can take that all the way down the spine of the Americas into South America, all the way to Patagonia, really. But in this part of the desert, it was just 2 lanes. And a road construction company, this is a great example of geopolitics, Chile has mineral resources that the rest of the developing world needs. Those include iron ore resources. So every day there is giant barges leaving the port of Caldera going out to India and China, carrying iron ore from the Andes, which is one of the most iron-rich mountain ranges on the planet. And to make room for mining equipment for all the mines that are in this part of the Atacama, they were increasing the width of the highway, so creating another 2 lanes of highway right through here. As the road construction company was going through, they kept on finding whale bones, really, really big whale bones. And because there are patrimony laws in Chile, unlike other places in Latin America, really strongly enforced natural patrimony laws, the road construction company had to let scientists know, had to let my colleagues know. So we just happened to be the right people at the right time to deal with what turned out to be not just 1 or 2, but 40 different whale skeletons all buried along the side of the road. So each one of these black tarps, by the time we actually got to work, many of the skeletons have been removed, but every other black tarp going off into the distance is another complete skeleton of whales, of a fossil whale. And so you can see this set of 3 here in the foreground, and that's actually, I've printed it out like this. This is not a complete 3D print, but it's a 3D model that was then that was assembled out of imagery that were scanned. And I'll tell you how we did that in a sec. But we were then able to print, obviously not at life size, little bigger in life, but there are scale bars on there, 20 and 30 centimeters. So this was a logistical challenge, and we didn't have much time. But fortunately, around this time, about 8 years ago, the Smithsonian was beginning to get invested in workflows and processes that relate to 3D digitization. And I'm sure in libraries here, you know all about Google Books and digitizing 2-dimensional objects. It's a little more complex when you have 3D objects, especially 3D objects that are the size of whale skeletons. So you can use a variety of different techniques, and here we are kind of posing mid-work. Nobody had ever done anything like this. So I was able to recruit people who weren't obliged to many projects at the Smithsonian to do something a little bit out of the box, which was come down to the Atacama Desert, create a tent around at least a few of these whale skeletons and photograph the others, and try to capture as much information about the skeletons and their context as possible. Because there was a basic scientific question, which is obviously, what are all these whale skeletons doing by the side of the road? Fossil record is mostly incomplete. So finding 1 complete skeleton was shocking. Finding 40, that's something else is going on here. But to comply with patrimony laws and the needs of the road construction company, we didn't have much time to collect this information. If we didn't collect information digitally, all these skeletons would be removed en masse, and we'd lose that power of context, because answering why questions in science, having context is key. If you just have the bones isolated from their context, and even like isolated from each other, you really lose the ability to answer why, what is going on. So with these tools, we're trying to capture as much data as possible. And actually, so that 3D model being circulated, that was generated using high resolution digital images just off a very good camera. But we also use laser arm scanners, because for one of the skeletons, which was really complete, we wanted to get micron scale data, preserve as much data as possible so we could go back to the lab and then do our analyses. With these data sets, we actually then created, with a private-public partnership, they actually printed one of these whales full size. If you come to the Natural History Museum, you can go to the Curious Education Center. We have an auditorium with this exact whale skeleton printed full size on the wall, which is really spectacular. It's something I didn't think you could do, but being involved with 3D digitization really opened my eyes to these workflows as being an important part of the job I do, at least in the field, of capturing information at scales that are really too large to do in a timely way otherwise. So it was the right technology to answer a scientific question. And so just to kind of move along in the talk, what we determined was going on with 40 some skeletons that all look like that, all complete nose to tip. One of the neat things about it, and if you see that 3D print going around, you can actually see that 2 out of the 3 whales in that print are preserved belly up. That is, the jaws are on top of the skull, the belly is pointing stratigraphic up. And that seems to be a dominant mode for most of the whales at the site. They're all very complete, and South America at the time, so if you look at the geology of the site, it's about 7 to 9 million years old. That's before South America is connected to North America through Central America. The Isthmus of Panama is not yet risen. So South America did not have large terrestrial carnivores that would have scavenged the bones. The only scavengers would be crabs and maybe a few large seabirds. So that in part explains why the whales are not really disarticulated. Also, the geology helps further. The site is actually, in terms of the rock sequence, best described as a tidal flat that is intermittently buried and then aerial. So these whales were probably stranded there, and that stranding idea is supported by the idea that most of them are belly up. And if you look carefully at those 3D prints, and you can kind of see this in the 3D model here, and if you have your phones or laptops out, that's totally okay, but you can find these 3D models and print one just like that at 3d.si.edu. You can see there's little orange spots and orange halos around a lot of the bones. Those are algal mats. And that first started getting me thinking about harmful algal blooms and whether or not this was an example of a mass stranding caused by harmful algae. And all the evidence that we can find definitely points to that as being the best explanation for all the whales at the site. And there's 2 other lines of evidence that really, I think, point to that in a strong way. One, there's not just whales at the site as well. When we really started looking, we found 2 different species of fossil seals. We found toothed whales, so there are not just large baleen whales like these guys. There's also echolocating toothed whales at the site. There's 2 billfishes, and there's aquatic sloths, marine herbivores that don't exist on the planet today, but 7 million years ago, this is something you had on the planet. So there's a whole range of marine mammals, all for the most part air breathing, but top trophic level predators that all are washed into the site. And as far as we can tell, the density of bones there probably is not just what we can see in the exposed quarries, but going laterally where the rock layers are. So this tidal flat had not just the 40 that we could see, but probably many, many more. And the last piece of evidence, there wasn't just one site there. There's actually 4 sites on top of each other. There's stratigraphic levels with different bone beds of complete whale skeletons. And that was one of the key insights that made me realize that this is a repeating phenomena. Whenever you have a repeating phenomena, you like simple explanations. And harmful algal blooms is the kind of thing that tends to happen in specific areas at specific times. The red stain, the orange staining that you see there, the orange halos, that's iron that's been mobilized, going back to the geopolitics, from the mountain ranges nearby in the Andes. And so iron being dissolved in the water, iron is a limiting agent in harmful algal blooms today. So all these pieces, to me, to my mind, point to harmful algal blooms as one of the best explanations for what we're seeing at the site. Repeated mass strandings in the same place in the same time. And this is an example from the fossil record of something that we know happens today. Now today, humans have a large role to play in generating harmful algal blooms, even if they are naturally occurring as well. We can talk more about that, but this is an example of being really lucky in the fossil record, and we were only able to actually communicate what we found because of having access at the right time to technology that could then generate 3D prints like that. So this was a really fun project and something I never dreamed of being able to do. So shifting the talk a bit now to whales today. We talk about them as a not just kind of interesting and mysterious animals, but also ecologically important in many different ways. They're large consumers. They eat a lot of food. And how they maintain those large body sizes is still something that we're trying to figure out. And that's exactly why you'd want to attach a probe to the back of the whales, not just to collect audio and visual data, but also to know something about the energetics involved. And we published a paper 2 months ago in Science that talked about the trade-off of energy in and energy out. How do whales make their living? And it was from assembling a large data set of tags from 11 different species of whales, both baleen whales and toothed whales, that were able to show there's strong scaling dimensions, depending on body size of whale, about how they're able to make the return on the investment of feeding. Here's a blue whale off the coast of California, just at the end of a giant lunge, where it's then engulfed a swarm of krill. And you can see a few individual krill just kind of outside the maw of death there. But, and this is a spectacular photo. This is from the BBC Blue Ocean series. It's a still from the video, but you can see the large pleated throat pouch of the blue whale engulfing that volume of water that it then strains out using baleen plates, this filter feeding apparatus that this branch of whales has evolved as a way to maximally return on that investment of gulp feeding. Now, what's really neat, to me at least, don't want to skip too far ahead, is that there's a strong shifted baseline to studying anything about these large predators in the ocean. Blue whales in particular, 99% of the blue whales that started off in the 20th century were not there by the 1970s. So the onset of the Marine Mammal Protection Act was only just in time, at least for resources within the US EEZ, but also globally as well. Most of the large blue whales, most of the population on the planet was removed by industrial whaling, pelagic whaling in the Southern Ocean in particular. And this is kind of funny. We kind of don't, I think this is not prevalent, at least in much of the history and a lot of the conservation stories you read, because we tend to think of Yankee whaling as having the largest impact. And for some species in North American waters, that's certainly true. For North Atlantic right whales, they never recovered from 19th century whaling. Why that is, nobody has a really good answer for, but there's only a few hundred left. So we want to make sure, I think, upcoming legislation hopefully will get passed to really help secure the future of North Atlantic right whales, which only number about 400 right now. And of those 400, there's only 100 breeding females. So that 100 is the number you really want to focus on. Blue whales in the early 20th century were also much larger than the blue whales today. There's reliable records of blue whales in excess of 100 feet long. And it's really hard to communicate that scale of size. We go to natural history museums to see whale models on display, or even their skeletons. But very few of those skeletons belong to blue whales, and certainly none of them belong to the 100-foot long plus individuals that were around in the early 20th century. And given how long blue whales live, if any of those animals left any descendants that still have the genes for large body size, it's probably going to be another few decades until we see blue whales at these large sizes. This might have been easily a 100-year-old blue whale at the time of harpooning. This is a shot from South Georgia Island, which had 7 different whaling stations in the 1920s. And this industry was mostly for oil. It was not really for the flesh or meat. And what's really interesting, South Georgia today still has relics of all these structures, and certainly a lot of the bones of these very large individuals. That's going to be really important because there's probably a lot of genomic material still in those tissues. Bony tissues have DNA. And if you can extract that ancient DNA, you might know something about genetic diversity for this species and any of the other species that were hunted in South Georgia in the Southern Ocean from that time. Because of climate change, that tissue is increasingly going to be susceptible to degradation. So now's the time to get back to South Georgia, and indeed any other polar place where we think there might be a record of bones and tissues that we want to plumb. And if you think about resources within the US EEZ, Alaska is certainly like that too. So any of the bowhead or other whalebone sites that we have on the North Slope, that probably has genomic material that we want to secure and recover as well. And that's something I'm really interested in looking at, because that's going to require people who know bones, but also who are able to collect samples as well. That's an emerging area of research I think is really interesting. So shifting away from baleen whales for a second, there's definitely factors about being a whale, living in the context of human civilization, that put you at risk of extinction. And this is an image of the Yangtze River Dolphin when it was first discovered in 1916, its discoverers here, Charles Hoy, having shot the type specimen in the Yangtze lake, it was a river, but at the time it was an oxbow lake. This is a species of toothed whale that adapted completely to living in rivers. And there are river dolphins throughout the world today. And one of the interesting facts about them is that from DNA analyses, looking at their genealogy, we now realize they're not all related to one another. They actually represent independent returns to freshwater ecosystems from marine ancestors. So the Yangtze river dolphin is not related to the Amazon river dolphin at all. They're very distantly related to each other. So they represent different invasions of these freshwater systems. And that obviously puts them right in the teeth of human civilization, because the Yangtze river dolphin went extinct with less than 100 years after its discovery in 1916. The reason why this photo is so important, I think, in some ways, it shows one of the few examples of what these animals look like in flesh. And also, we have this skeleton at the Smithsonian. This became the type specimen that was sent back to Washington, D.C. and described in 1918. And there are a few other species of whales like that where they were described in the 20th century, but none that went extinct, although one of them probably will soon. Okay, so I just want to slide in. This is the last image of a captive Yangtze river dolphin in 2000 or 2002. This individual died in 2002 or 2004. But since then, there's been no trace of them living in the wild. So they have been declared extinct. The other river dolphins are not doing so great either. The Amazon river dolphin is probably doing the best among the river dolphins, but there is also one that lives in South Asia in a variety of the river systems there, the Ganges and the Indus rivers. So from the standpoint of large mammals that live near human civilization, they're definitely at risk, not just from ship strike, but from pollution, noise. There's a variety of factors, not just even related to their prey sources. Human modification of river ecosystems has obviously had a large role to play in the changes in their habitat, and it's no surprise that river dolphins are really highly at risk today. Having a restricted range is obviously a bad thing too if you're a cetacean. This is an image of the Vaquita, which is a small species of porpoise that lives in the Gulf of California today. And when I was writing my book, I was actually writing it, watching the news and talking to colleagues who are involved in trying to do ex situ conservation, because their numbers were in the single digits, maybe not more. Marine mammalogists have watched the population of the Vaquita dwindle from a few hundred in the 90s to maybe no more than a dozen today. And so 2 years ago, there's some NOAA scientists who actually did this in collaboration with Mexican marine mammalogists and government officials to try to abate and actually just try to secure the last surviving Vaquita in some kind of sea pen, because these small porpoises, and this is almost an image at life size. I mean, they're small enough as adults to hold in your arms. They live in the Gulf of California, but they are victims of the gillnet industry, which is actually going not after Vaquita, but after a large species of bony fish whose swim bladder fetches tens of thousands of dollars on Asian markets for its reputed medicinal properties. Who knows? But Vaquita get wrapped up along with these large fish called totoaba. And because it's an industry that's driven by international trade, international markets, and cartels in Mexico, it's been very, very hard to regulate, even with the Mexican government playing a role, and even with philanthropists like Leonardo DiCaprio and Carlos Slim. It's really hasn't moved the needle on conservation for Vaquita. So what they tried to do 2 years ago was create these sea pens and go after any of the surviving ones and put them in sea pens to at least give them a secure environment until more regulations could be enforced. Well, one of the things that happened in the process of trying to do ex situ conservation, they caught a calf and the calf died. So when your population, when that lineage, there's no other place on the planet where this species of porpoise lives, when you lose a calf, everybody decided to stop. And one of the most amazing things about this story, I thought this species would be extinct. I thought it was heading towards oblivion. They're not extinct yet. Last year, they documented 3 individuals just from visual surveys, which had never been documented before. For the most part, you know about these individuals from acoustic surveys. Porpoises are legendarily really secretive and hard to follow. So there is some hope to think that Vaquita may not be on its way out, but certainly with low numbers, you can't be that optimistic. So again, these even by not actively hunting cetaceans, living alongside humans seems to be put them at jeopardy, especially with really restricted geographic ranges. And there's that calf that was captured in 2017, I think. So let's take a step back to whaling, though, because that's certainly on the mind, I think, for a lot of people, maybe, if you don't know much about human interactions with whales. And so whaling still happens, and it happens in the United States. The United States is a participant in the International Whaling Commission. And, you know, the words International Whaling Commission make you think it's kind of like the United Nations, but it's not. It's a hunting club. It's more like the Tuna Commission than it is like anything else. It's a loose body without regulation that comes to some agreed rules. Now, what's interesting, the International Whaling Commission was formed after World War II, actually with scientists from the Smithsonian. My predecessor at the Smithsonian, a man I never met named Remington Kellogg, was one of the founders of the International Whaling Commission. Because at the time, you could think back to that slide of the blue whale in the from South Georgia, in the 1920s, whales were being hunted at such large numbers, nobody knew if they were actually all going to make it through the 20th century. And this was already, well, this is something that people could see in the 1940s. So Remington Kellogg got together with other conservationists and other federal scientists and leveraged, this is a bit of scientific diplomacy, leveraged his international contacts to create this International Whaling Commission that would create some kind of apparatus, some kind of structure. It wasn't exactly a legal structure, but it was some kind of agreed commitment, quotas for whaling. And while it didn't it prevented no species from going extinct, the abundances of almost all whales in the 20th century dropped precipitously, down, 90–95%. Bowheads in the Arctic, so this is in Alaska, that's a bowhead whale, another filter feeding whale. They were, for the most part, decimated in the 19th century. This is mostly a fishery that, so-called fishery, that happened in the 19th century. And bowheads are not particularly endangered, and they're a form of sustenance for indigenous peoples, American citizens, who live in the Arctic Circle. And so they have an exemption from the Marine Mammal Protection Act to go after bowheads and actually collect the meat for their villages. And they eat bowhead meat throughout the winter. It's a form of sustenance, also part of their culture. So this is an important aspect to talking about whaling and whales that you wouldn't see if you just glossed over this and listened to, for example, the TV shows like Whale Wars that are mostly about whaling in the Southern Ocean by Japan, which conducts scientific whaling, which is really a different thing from what this is. Scientific whaling is an agenda-based thing that really doesn't have any merits if you're a scientist, because all the questions you'd want to ask from the standpoint of scientific whaling, you can address using non-lethal methods. So instead, whaling in Japan is much more about sovereignty. There's a more political dimension to it. Now, great point of history, if you look back to Japanese whaling, the reason why they went back to whaling in the 20th century was because of us. It was part of the reparations from World War II. So, if you just look at this vignette of interactions and politics and whaling, you wouldn't realize that there's much deeper historical ties that go across countries that do have a lot of involvement in the United States as well. But bowheads are certainly not in any risk of going extinct. And access to bowhead whale tissue by scientists who work with whalers, including some of my colleagues, has revealed some really insightful facts. For one, it looks like bowheads live a very long time. They might live 200 years or more. So there might be bowhead whales living in the Arctic right now that were born during the time of Lewis and Clark. Now that's a spectacular fact, but if you think about what that whale may have seen in terms of changes to ocean ecosystems, there's a very good research question here. Are bowhead whales any form of ocean sentinel? Do they have recording tissues, any kind of accretionary tissues that may record those changes in ocean ecosystems over that time period that would be very hard to access otherwise? And they also have really long baleen plates. Their individual plates in their mouth are some 10, 13 feet long for really mature animals. And those baleen plates are made out of keratin, the same kind of material like our hair and fingernails, which do record the body's changes over time. A 13-foot long baleen plate records some 10, 13 years of life of that animal. And at the Smithsonian in particular, we have bowhead whale baleen plates from the 19th century. And we have samples all throughout the intervening years. So there's, you could imagine assembling a timeline of baleen plates And if you're really clever about how you ask questions, you might be able to find out more about changes in ocean ecosystems over that time period. And I have a colleague who was a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian who's investigating that right now. We're writing up the paper on that, looking at the baleen plate timeline for bowhead whales. And it's really, really neat. It actually shows a clear signal of whaling in the Arctic in the 19th century and the changes in ocean ecosystems from that. Of course, if you're, this is a North Atlantic right whale, which is the closest relative to bowheads. Living today along the eastern seaboard is a life of suffering if you're a North Atlantic right whale. If you somehow avoid ship strike from cargo ships or cruise ships, entanglement is a huge risk. And these are mostly from lobster traps off the coast of Maine and also certainly in Canada too. Because of climate change, the migration of North Atlantic right whales, which feed in the summer times at higher latitudes, come down to Georgia and Florida in the winter, puts them further and further north into Canadian waters, which actually don't have any protection. There is no Marine Mammal Protection Act in Canada. And so they're retroactively trying to create legislation to protect the passage of North Atlantic right whales from being hit by ships in the St. Lawrence Seaway. Whereas in the United States, we've actually already implemented changes to shipping in Boston Harbor, which puts right whales in conflict with boats because the copepods that right whales eat show up in Boston Harbor in the summer. But this is an interesting photo of an entangled right whale being, or at least trying to be liberated by volunteers who accost them under NOAA permits to free them from the ropes. It's really kind of a treacherous operation, and people have been killed doing this. So this is one of the challenges of whales now living alongside us. They live in increasingly urbanized oceans, especially if their prey resources along the coast put them right in contact with us. So it's not just about pollution and plastic ingestion. This is a very real fact. And in many cases, you have right whales dragging traps for hundreds of kilometers, if not 1,000 kilometers along their migration. And we know from looking at signals from their blow, we can actually have a snot bot come in, collect samples from their spray, and that tells you a lot about the stresses and their stress hormones. Those animals are hugely stressed from dragging those traps up and down the eastern seaboard. And when there's only 100 breeding females left, you have to wonder what that means about the future of the species. And hopefully there's still time to do something. So I think this is kind of towards the end of my talk. This is again a shot from Wilhelmina Bay in Antarctica. But one of the things that really drives me, at least, from thinking about whales past, present, and future is that we're living very much in the golden age of whale science. This is an image collected from a drone in Wilhelmina Bay, shot on NOAA permits. So we need NOAA permits to shoot imagery of drones up in the air in Antarctica, because there's no other permitting system other than the one National Marine Fisheries Service has. But this kind of imagery was impossible 10 years ago. You just didn't have the technology to do it. And now we're able to generate thousands of hours and images that can be calibrated. You can actually get numbers on these images of the size of the whale and the density of the prey that they're eating. Not to say anything of this incredible corralling behavior using bubble nets. Each one of those little white pockets are bubbles that whale at the top has emitted from its blowhole as the other one comes up to feed on those fish in a barrel. It's probably krill, but not fish here. But still, this is a behavior that had been documented by many different scientists from boats for many years until you're able to get a drone up in the air to see it overhead. That's the kind of data set that grad students now have in abundance. So they have tons of data. I think it means that we just got to get better at asking our questions to make use of all this fantastic information. So I think I'm done for now. We can go to the Q&A if you want. But thank you.
Thank you so much,
listening.
Nick. Yeah. Does anyone in the room have a question? Questions in the audience?
Yeah, those are two humpback whales. And we've sometimes seen the behavior, we scientists have seen the behavior of 3 to 4. And what's really neat is that this is a transmitted learned behavior. And from what we know of biopsied animals is that these are largely unrelated humpback whales that are interacting with one another. And those associations are ephemeral. So it's not always the same ones that cooperatively hunt over the years, although they may do so for a day or two. And we've seen this behavior in 3 different places of the world: Antarctica, off the coast of Alaska, and off the coast of Massachusetts in Stellwagen. So that behavior, once you get biopsies and you get these kind of visual surveys, you can actually use network analysis to see how that information is transmitted. So when you have information being transmitted outside of the body, that's being learned over time across unrelated individuals, that kind of fulfills the criteria of culture. So, you know, I think there's a good case to be made for culture in whales. A lot of anthropologists really don't like that, but I think that increasingly we see a lot more examples of culture in the animal world. Does that answer your question? That's kind of longer.
Any questions in the room? Yes.
I'm curious, out of all the thousands of specimens. Oh yeah, sure. I'm curious, out of all the thousands of specimens you have at the museum, if you have an estimate of how many species those represent, extant and extinct.
So that's pretty easy. We have, so the question, did you catch that? Or, okay, got it. So how many species of living whales do we have at the Smithsonian's collections? How many extinct ones? For the living ones, very easy to answer. We have nearly all the 80 species or so of living cetaceans. Now there are new ones being described. One was described last year, Berardius minimus, the dwarf Baird's beaked whale, the black, I forget what, there's a Japanese common name for it. I forget what see, I don't even know the common name for it. Berardius minimus, which is a smaller form of Baird's beaked whale. Baird's beaked whale, named after Spencer Fullerton Baird. So there's a long history of the Smithsonian of naming whales after curators. I've named a fossil whale after one of my co-curators. So we have most of the living species of whales, and we're always trying to get better coverage. For the living species, what's great is you want to increase the depth of variation, so you want to get as many N samples within those lineages. We have obviously much better samples for bottlenose dolphins than we do for some of the rarer ones from the Southern Ocean. So whenever there's the opportunity, we like to do exchanges with other institutions. That spreads the wealth and creates duplicates, because sometimes natural history museums catch on fire. And if you remember the National Museum in Brazil, that went up in flames 2 years ago. So that's a big reminder that it can happen anywhere, and it can happen at the Smithsonian just as much as it could happen in Brazil. So we do like to have backups, and that's another reason for having digital copies. Digital copies don't make the original thing less valuable. It makes it more valuable, but it does provide a form of backup. For the extinct ones, we have there are some 800 so extinct species of whales named. We probably have about 100 of those in our collections. Question mark though, and because we have many, many more that have not been described. In my time there, I've described 12 new species of extinct whales, and so I try to do like one a year. That's kind of the pace I try to do it at. Yeah, there's so many more to be described, and that's the amazing thing. We still don't know how many species of living whales are on the planet. I can tell you there's many more extinct species, many bizarre ones. I mentioned some of them in my book, actually. And the neat thing about the fossil ones is they sometimes tell you about past modes or past functions that we don't see in living whales whatsoever. One of my favorites is an extinct species of whale called Odobenus cetops. And if you know your marine mammals, Odobenus is today's walrus, right? So cetops is whale-faced, the whale-faced, or the walrus-faced whale. And so it's a species of dolphin that evolved a fully walrus-like head that only lived off the coast of South America at the same time as that whale graveyard in Chile. And we actually found a specimen of Odobenus cetops in the whale graveyard, and that was spectacular. I think it's actually a new species. We're still working on that. I have a 3D print of it in my lab. But yeah, those, sometimes you see, so there are no walruses in the southern hemisphere, and it looks like in the past, dolphins occupied that niche, at least off the coast of South America. That is pretty cool. That's a great example of evolution at work whenever you see convergence like that. But that's also a surprise that you wouldn't otherwise know from just looking at the living diversity of whales. We find narwhal and beluga relatives at temperate latitudes. That's one of the examples in the narwhal exhibit at the Natural History Museum, which is going on travel soon now. So yeah, sure.
Any other questions in the room? One in the back.
Do scientists have an estimate?
Repeat it into here. Thank you.
Yep. Do scientists have an estimate of the number of blue whales today, and what is their range?
Yeah, so for a lot of these, this is actually where the International Whaling Commission, this is the point I wanted to make. The International Whaling Commission has a huge role to play because it is a venue for scientists around the world to exchange information in a free way in these kind of informal gray publications. So there's actually no scientists that represent the United States delegation at the International Whaling Commission. And it's a way for scientists to not have to worry about publishing something in the peer-reviewed literature, but share information about how many whales are still out there. A lot of that is just something the government scientists may know that may not get out into the published literature. So for blue whales, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, there's maybe 1,000 or so in the North Atlantic and certainly about 4,000 in the North Pacific. And we know more about the ones in the North Pacific than we do in the North Atlantic, at least in terms of where they're migrating, because a lot of them have been tagged with satellite tags that stay on for a long time. So we know in the North Pacific, blue whales winter over in the Costa Rica Dome, which is a big patch of water, probably about 1,000 miles west of Costa Rica. And then they migrate in the summer up to the California current system where they feed on krill. In the Southern Ocean, nobody knows. Blue whales are really still rare. Right whales are still rare. I would say the Southern Ocean, we really don't know what has recovered from whaling, except for humpbacks. It looks like humpback whales have recovered. And that actually documents a shift in the ecosystem, because if you look back at any reports of whales around Antarctica in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, humpbacks are not common. You get lots of blue whales, lots of fin whales, right whales, not that many humpbacks. Today, it's all humpbacks among the baleen whales. So it's something that's definitely happened, and we're probably responsible for it. But yeah, there's still not that many blue whales on the planet relative to how many there were. There were probably 100, 200,000 at the early 20th century. So.
We do have some questions online, but we'll grab this one first.
So maybe this isn't exactly your area, but are you seeing an impact of how the ocean is changing, affecting how the whales, their migration patterns? For example, this morning on TV, they showed a little clip of gray whales and a calf up in San Diego, and I'm like, San Diego already? But, you know.
So we're February. So gray whales, okay, that's a complex question. Oceans are definitely changing. They're acidifying, they're getting warmer further north, more variation to periodic patterns that we know in oceanographic systems. I guess one of the big questions is, how will biodiversity respond to those changes in physical systems? And we're still finding out. For very large marine predators that are mobile, they're going to chase where the prey show up. A lot of the larger marine mammals chase oceanographic fronts, where we do have physical changes that give you upwelling or huge resources if you're out in the open ocean, upwelling if you're closer to the coast. If you're able to put satellite tags on your marine mammals, then you can actually track that in some kind of real-time way, where you can get overlapping data sets between, say, NOAA satellites and actually the tracks of animal movement. So there's a very rich literature about that, and you might be able to then predict where things are going to go. And people have talked about that. Basically, the whales will probably go further north. The Arctic will probably, there'll probably almost no summer sea ice by 2040, 2050. So there will be a pelagic Arctic Ocean in maybe the middle of this century, towards the end of this century. You'll have a very different whale fauna in the Arctic than today. For individual species, I think we won't yet know. Gray whales migrate from Baja California all the way up to Alaska. It's one of the longest migrations that we know of among whales. And they do this annually to feed in the Bering Shelf and then come back down to Baja California to reproduce. So right about this time in February, gray whales are probably starting to move up. And if things are warmer, if the blob is still having its presence felt, maybe gray whales are leaving earlier. It's just about this time of year that gray whales start migrating north, so that they end up on the Bering Shelf May, June, right? So I'm not kind of too surprised to see a gray whale calf wandering into San Diego, because they do hug the coastline. if you're a gray whale, you do not want to be picked off by killer whales, which roam along the coastlines. That's their major predator, especially for calves. So, yeah, so large whales are curious. A lot of them end up in freshwater river systems. I mean, humpbacks go up the San Mateo River, so yeah. It's hard to know what the individual isolated events mean in the broader scope. And this is one of the big problems we have with the stranding record. Is the stranding record just telling us what merely happens to die, or is it actually telling us more about a biological response? Are the large-scale die-offs really indicative of something happening in the oceans or not? And part of the problem is we don't always get the chance to do necropsies. Necropsies would be kind of the gold standard of being able to know what happened to that whale. And a lot of times these whales wash up and nobody's there to do the necropsy, or they're too decayed to do that. So that's always a challenge. I think we need more marine mammal scientists working for the government. That's my view.
So you're saying it's just a little too early to tell you?
Oh, I'm sure there's things happen. I think we're just not, is it too early to tell? I think we don't have enough people reporting. I think it's a reporting aspect. It's not that we need to wait and see if there's actually if climate change is having an impact on marine mammal populations. Some will be winners and some will be losers. And it's not just climate change, there's also humans playing a role too. As we have more commerce in the ocean, we'll have more ships at sea. There's greater risk of ship strike. So, this is a complex world with many factors. It's not just one particular line of evidence.
We do have a few
Yeah.
questions online, and not a lot of times, so I'm going to grab one of them, and I'll send you the other ones.
Okay, yeah, I can
offline.
just answer them.
Yeah. Okay.
After.
So talking a little bit about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and kind of the deep oil drilling industry versus whales. What is your kind of take on the future of whales with that?
Yeah, well, so Deep Horizon is, I forget the Deep Horizon disaster, whatever the shorthand is. Spilling that many millions of gallons of oil into the Gulf certainly had an impact on marine mammals. I think that's pretty clear from the reports, and that's still having a lingering effect on bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf. There may be a new species of Broodies whale in the Gulf of Mexico that may number in just a few dozen. We have one of our most recent accessions to the Smithsonian's collection is a skeleton from that population, of an individual from that population. So we have pretty good sense of its molecular data, its DNA data in terms of where it falls in that group. Whether or not it's a new species, that's a different determination. Whales are definitely at risk from those kinds of disasters. Certainly petroleum exploration uses a lot of noisy equipment in underwater. And from the little we know, whales are mostly acoustic animals underwater. Visual detection is really not one of their primary modes of navigating and communicating. So certainly in places like Alaska, petroleum exploration we know that it has an impact on their behavior. Is that really detrimental to their health? That's a different question. That's harder to demonstrate. I suspect, yeah, but you would want to be able to demonstrate that along with any mortalities. And those data aren't they're not always available. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we are up on time. So thank you. We will send you the online questions later, but thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick.